Kim Dae-yun didn't build an empire by making deals. He built it by breaking men. But tonight, in the falling snow, the stone heart feels something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. Across the plaza stands Lee Jae-hyun, the man who pulled his son from an icy grave. He isn't armed. He isn't shouting. He's holding something small. A crumpled drawing. 3 figures sketched in childish lines. For a moment, the most feared man in Seoul forgets how to breathe. Jae-hyun steps closer. "I've come to collect," he says quietly. And this time, the debt isn't something Dae-yun can pay with money. It's a demand that will force the king of Seoul to choose between his crown and his conscience. Because everyone standing here understands one thing. A debt between these two men is never small, and tonight, the legend is about to lose something he cannot replace. Like, share and subscribe for more stories like this. The air in the plaza was so still that the sound of falling snow hitting the pavement felt like a physical weight. Kim Dae-yun's security detail moved as a single, lethal machine, their hands hovering over concealed weapons, eyes locked on Lee Jae-hyun's throat. They were waiting for the word, the signal that would turn this snowy confrontation into a bloodbath. But Dae-yun didn't give it. He stood like a monolith of charcoal and ice, his gaze fixed not on the rival who had just demanded his crown jewel, but on the crumpled drawing in Jae-hyun's gloved hand. He knew that paper. He knew the specific shade of blue Min Seo used for the water and the jagged, uncertain lines he used for his father's shoulders. "Stand down," Dae-yun said. The command was low, devoid of heat, yet it carried the absolute authority of a man who had never been disobeyed. "Boss, he's asking for the district," his head of security hissed, his voice tight with disbelief. "It's a trap. If we give him the Han River, we're handing him the throat of the city." Dae-yun didn't flinch. He didn't look broken or desperate. Instead, he looked more calculating than ever. He wasn't reacting to a threat. He was making a move that no one in the plaza was smart enough to understand yet. He looked Jae-hyun in the eye, searching for the crack in the other man's composure. But he found only a mirror of his own resolve. To the city watching from the tinted windows of surrounding skyscrapers, this would look like a surrender. But to Dae-yun, it was an investment. "The Han River District is a collection of concrete and shadows," Dae-yun said, his voice cutting through the wind like a blade. "My son's life is a debt that cannot be settled with property. If Lee Jae-hyun wants the docks, give him the docks. Prepare the deeds by dawn." The silence that followed was deafening. By agreeing without a single moment of hesitation, Dae-yun hadn't revealed a weakness. He had demonstrated a terrifying level of control. He was telling the world that he was so powerful, he could give away the most valuable territory in Seoul and still sleep soundly. He was choosing the boy, but he was doing it with the cold, surgical logic of a king. "I gave my word," Dae-yun continued, stepping closer to Jae-hyun until they were inches apart. The security team held their breath. "In this city, my word is the only thing more permanent than the river itself. You want the debt paid? Fine. Take the keys. But understand this, Jae-hyun, when you step into my territory, you're not just taking the profit. You're taking the target that comes with it." He didn't wait for a reply. Dae-yun turned his back on his rival, a move of supreme confidence, and walked toward his car. As he reached the door, he paused, looking at the drawing one last time before slipping into the shadows of the SUV. This stone heart wasn't melting. It was hardening into something new, something that cared less about land and more about the blood that ran through his son's veins. The city would whisper of his fall, but as the convoy began to move, Dae-yun's expression remained unreadable. He had just paid the highest price in his life, and he had done it without blinking. The Han River docks were a forest of rusted iron and salt-stained concrete, usually buzzing with the frantic energy of 1,000 men under Dae-yun's thumb. But today, the crane stood frozen against a slate-gray sky. The transfer was not happening in a boardroom. It was happening in the mud. Word had traveled through the city's veins faster than a fever. The stone heart was handing over the keys. Min Seo sat in the back of the armored SUV, his small forehead pressed against the cold glass. He watched as his father walked toward Jae-hyun, who stood surrounded by a new, unfamiliar security detail. The workers, men with scarred knuckles and hard eyes, stood in clusters, their breaths blooming in the air like smoke. They weren't working, they were mourning. The whispers were a physical tide, rising from the docks to the streets. Soft, compromised, finished. Mincio didn't need to hear the words to feel the weight of them. He saw the way his father's head of security stared at the ground, unable to look at the man he had served for 20 years. Jae-hyun didn't gloat. He stood with a terrifying, quiet dominance as Diyun produced a heavy ring of keys and a single, black digital drive. There were no cameras, no press, but the world was watching. Every rival syndicate in Seoul had eyes on this pier. When Diyun dropped the keys into Jae-hyun's open palm, the metallic clink echoed like a hammer on a coffin. Minecio's breath fogged the window. He remembered the river, the way the water felt like 1,000 needles, the way the man in the navy coat had reached for him when the world was turning black. Now, he saw that same man taking his father's pride. The boy's chest ached with a guilt that felt too large for a 7-year-old to carry. He knew his father was the king, and he knew a king without a kingdom was just a man. He watched as his father turned back toward the car, his stride still rhythmic and powerful, but to Mincio, he looked like he was walking through a storm. As the SUV began to roll away, the boy looked back one last time. Jae-hyun was already signaling the workers, his voice sharp and commanding, reclaiming the territory that had belonged to the Kim family for generations. The news was already hitting the encrypted channels. The Han River had a new master. Mincio reached out, touching the back of his father's seat, his fingers grazing the fine leather. He wanted to say he was sorry. He wanted to tell his father to take the docks back. But Dean just stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the road. The empire was breaking, and as the city lights blurred past, Mincio realized that the price of his life had been his father's crown. Elder Park didn't walk into the room like a man planning a coup. He walked in like a man mourning a friend. He moved slowly, his polished cane clicking against the marble floor of Dean's private study with a heavy, rhythmic finality. He looked at the empty space on the wall where the Han River District maps used to hang, territory that had been the foundation of their power for 2 decades, and let out a sigh that sounded like a prayer for the dead. He sat across from Diyun, leaning forward with the kind of practiced concern that had earned him the title of the Mafia's most trusted advisor. "The streets are talking, Diyun," Park said, his voice a low, melodic rasp. "And they aren't talking about your mercy. They're talking about your exit." Diyun didn't look up from the tablet he was holding. His face was a mask of cold concentration, but Park was looking for the cracks. He was looking for the father who had traded a kingdom for a child, a man he believed had finally grown soft enough to kill. Park reached into his inner pocket and placed a black and white photo on the desk. It was Jae-hyun, standing on the docks, surrounded by the men who used to report to Diyun. "You did a noble thing for your son," Park continued, his tone shifting to something more paternal, more poisonous. "But a king who gives away his sword is just a target. The other families see the Han River in his hands, and they think you've lost your nerve. They think the stone heart has stopped beating." He paused, watching for a reaction. When none came, Park leaned in closer, his eyes reflecting the dim light of the study. "There is only one way to restore the balance. Jae-hyun has to go. He served his purpose. He saved the boy. Now he's a liability holding our crown. If you don't order the hit, the men will start wondering who they're truly following. They're looking for a reason to stay loyal. Diyun, give it to them. Let me handle the arrangements. It will be clean, quick, and the city will know that no one takes from you without paying in blood." It was the perfect advice, the kind of logical, ruthless move the old Diyun would have made without a second thought. Park waited for the nod, the silent permission that would set his own rise to power in motion. If Diyun killed the man who saved his son, he would lose his honor and the boy's love. If he refused, he would lose his men. Either way, Park won. But Diyun finally looked up, his eyes as unreadable as the river. "You've always been worried about my legacy, Park," Diyun said quietly. "I only care about your survival, boss," Park replied, his lips curving into the faintest, most respectful of smiles. "I know." Dean said, his voice dropping to a whisper. That's why I gave him the district. Because I knew exactly who would come into this room today and tell me to kill him. For a split second, the smile on Park's face faltered. It was the smallest of glitches in his performance, a momentary chill that had nothing to do with the winter outside. He looked at Du-Yun, searching for a trap, but the Mafia boss simply turned back to his screen. The poison had been poured, but as Park stood up to leave, he felt a strange, nagging sensation that he wasn't the one holding the vial. His stone heart was still beating, and for the first time in 20 years, Park realized he didn't know the rhythm. The air inside Warehouse 7 smelled of stagnant river water and ozone. It was a cavernous, skeletal structure in the heart of the district Dune had just surrendered, lit only by the flickering blue glow of a row of high-end monitors set up on a makeshift desk. Lee Jae-hyun stood in the center of the room, his navy coat draped over a chair, looking less like a conqueror and more like a man preparing for a funeral. As Du-Yun stepped into the light, his hand gripped the handle of his weapon, but Jae-hyun didn't even turn around. He simply tapped a key on a laptop. You think I took this district to hurt your pride, Jae-hyun said, his voice echoing against the corrugated steel walls. But I took it because it's the only place in Seoul your loyal advisor couldn't scrub clean. A video feed flickered to life on the central screen. The timestamp was from 10 years ago, the night the explosion took Jae-hyun's world. The footage was grainy, but the location was unmistakable, a basement office in this very warehouse. A younger elder Park appeared on screen, leaning over a table, sliding a thick envelope of cash to a man whose face was obscured by a hood. There was no audio, but the exchange was surgical. Park didn't look like a man being coerced. He looked like a man placing an order. Du-Yun stepped closer, his breath hitching. This proves nothing. We were at war then. Everyone was making moves. Then listen to this, Jae-hyun countered, clicking a secondary file. The audio was crisp, recorded only 3 weeks ago. It was Park's voice, unmistakable in its calm, melodic rasp. The boy is a liability. His father's heart has turned to glass. If the child disappears in the river, Du-Yun will drown in his own grief. That is when we step in. Ensure the guards are looking the other way. I want him under the ice before the convoy reaches the bridge. Du-Yun felt a coldness spread through his limbs that made the January snow feel like a fever. He watched a second video feed, this one from the security cameras near the Han riverbank. He saw his own men, the ones he had personally vetted, stepping back into the shadows as a small figure in a knit beanie and red gloves was led toward the freezing ledge. He saw the betrayal in real time. He saw the exact moment his son was pushed. The silence that followed was a physical force. Du-Yun didn't shout. He didn't break the monitors. He simply stood there, his stone heart, finally shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces of realization. Every move he had made for a decade, every person he had buried, every sacrifice he had made for the empire, it had all been orchestrated by the man who sat at his dinner table. The servers are physically wired into the foundation of this building, Jae-hyun said quietly, stepping beside him. If I hadn't demanded the district, Park would have wiped these drives the moment he realized I survived the river. I didn't take your land to rule it, Du-Yun. I took it to keep the truth from being erased. Du-Yun looked at the screen, then at the man he had called his enemy for 10 years. The debt wasn't just paid, it was reversed. He realized then that the wrong man had been the only one telling him the truth. In the dim, blue light of the warehouse, the Mafia boss finally saw the ghosts he had been living with, and the one man who was brave enough to hunt them down. The blue light of the monitors cast long, skeletal shadows against the warehouse walls, but the real darkness was the silence that followed the recording. Du-Yun didn't move. He stood with his hands clenched at his sides, his breathing so shallow it was almost non-existent. This stone heart was no longer a metaphor. It was a physical weight in his chest, cold and jagged. He stared at the grainy image of Elder Park, the man who had walked him through his wife's funeral, the man who had held Min Seo at his christening, realizing that every moment of comfort had been a calculation. He told me the explosion was an accident, Du-Yun whispered, his voice sounding like it was being dragged over broken glass. He told me your family died because of a gas leak. He used my guilt to turn me into a weapon against you. Jae-hyun didn't look away from the screen. He needed us to be enemies, Do-yoon. As long as we were trying to kill each other, we were too busy to look at who was actually holding the matches. For 10 years, you hunted me for a crime I didn't commit, and I hunted you for a lie he created. We were both his puppets. Do-yoon's denial flickered one last time, a dying spark. But the river, why Min Seo? He loved that boy. He doesn't love anything but the chair you're sitting in, Jae-hyun replied, his voice hardening. Min Seo wasn't just a child to him. He was the only thing keeping you human. If the boy died, you would have burned the city down in a blind rage. And in the chaos, Park would have stepped up to restore order. He didn't just try to kill your son. He tried to kill the last part of you that wasn't made of stone. The realization hit Do-yoon with the force of a physical blow. He thought of the decade he had spent building an empire on the advice of a murderer. He thought of the times he had nearly pulled the trigger on Jae-hyun, believing he was seeking justice for his own family's blood. Every drop of blood on his hands felt heavier now, poisoned by the truth. He looked at Jae-hyun, really looked at him, seeing the same hollowed-out grief in his rival's eyes that had mirrored his own for so long. I took the Han River district because I knew you would give it to me to save him, Jae-hyun said, stepping into Do-yoon's line of sight. I needed you to look weak so Park would feel strong enough to move. I needed him to think he had finally won so he would stop hiding. Do-yoon lowered his head, his shoulders finally sagging under the weight of a decade-old lie. The anger was there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was eclipsed by a profound, agonizing silence. He had spent 10 years hating the man who had just saved his son's life twice, once from the water and once from the shadow. I almost killed you, Do-yoon said, the words barely audible. 12 times. I almost killed the only man who was actually watching over my son. Then don't waste the truth now, Jae-hyun replied, his voice a low, steady anchor in the dark. The debt isn't paid until the shadow is gone. Park is waiting for you to come home and tell him I'm dead. Let's not keep him waiting. The air in Do-yoon's penthouse was thick with the scent of expensive sandalwood and the looming rot of a decade-old lie. Elder Park sat in his usual leather armchair, his posture composed, his expression wearing that same mask of paternal worry that had deceived the stone heart for 10 years. He leaned forward, tapping his cane on the floor. The Han River is slipping, Do-yoon. Jae-hyun is already consolidating his power. If you don't eliminate him tonight, the city will think you've handed him your throat to cut. Do-yoon stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to the room. He didn't answer. He didn't rage. He simply reached for a remote on the marble side table. The massive security screens on the wall flickered to life. There was no static, only the crystal-clear playback from Warehouse 7. Park's own voice filled the room, cold and melodic, ordering the drowning of a 7-year-old boy. The timestamp was bright red, a digital confession. Park's face went gray, the mask of the loyal advisor shattering in the reflected blue light of his own betrayal. You used the debt, Park whispered, his voice failing him as he realized the tactical genius of the move. The transfer, it gave him legal access to the encrypted servers. You let him into the one place I couldn't scrub. No. A voice drifted from the shadows of the hallway. Lee Jae-hyun stepped into the light, his navy coat draped over his shoulders, his expression entirely unreadable. You gave it to me, Park. 10 years ago, you buried the wrong man. You should have made sure I was dead before you started building your kingdom on my family's ashes. Park looked from the rival to the king, his breath coming in ragged hitches. He saw the two most powerful men in Seoul standing on the same side of the line for the first time in history. He reached for his cane, perhaps for a weapon, perhaps just for balance, but Do-yoon finally turned around. His eyes weren't full of fire. They were as flat and cold as the river in January. Remove him, Do-yoon said. It wasn't a shout. It was a disposal order for a piece of broken furniture. The security team, men who had taken Park's orders for years, didn't hesitate. They stepped forward, closing the circle. Park was erased by the very system he had spent a lifetime perfecting, led away into the shadows without a single word of mercy. An hour later, the two men stood alone on the balcony. Jae-hyun pulled the black leather folder from his coat, the deeds to the Han River District, and set them on the railing between them. The servers are wiped. The witnesses are secured. The district is yours again. Jae-hyun didn't reach for the folder. He looked out at the city, then back at the hallway where Min Seo was finally sleeping in a room no longer haunted by a traitor. The city now has two kings, Jae-hyun, and neither of them trusts the other. Good, Jae-hyun replied, his voice a low, steady anchor. Trust is what got us into this. Let's try something else. Let's try being the men who make sure the boy never has to learn how to hold a gun. They stood in the silence, two guardians carved from the same stone, watching the snow settle over a city that had no idea the world had changed. They weren't friends. They were a synchronized unit, a lethal partnership born from a debt that could never truly be paid. The war was over, but as the lights of Seoul flickered below, they both knew the real work of keeping the peace was just beginning.